afternoon, and welcome back to the fall semester of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. My name is Thi Anh, and I'm teaching Vietnamese, and I would like to introduce Dr. Merav Shohet from University of Toronto. She's going to give the first talk in the series at the center today about two deaths and a funeral, grief, moral effects, and ritual inscriptions in Vietnam. I have known Dr. Shohet for, I would say, more than a decade, since 2002, when I first know how she was interested in Vietnamese culture and language, and I have been following her research since 2007. So I'm really happy to have her here to share with us some of her most important, I would say so, but she would say just one part of her research. And so we hope that we will have a fruitful discussion after that. And also I need to mention that the talk will be video tape for archive, so I hope that everyone is aware of that and you don't mind. And so let's start.
Okay. So thank you so much. Really, thank you so much for being here today and for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's my first time in Michigan. And so today I'm going to be discussing just a small part of my research, which was largely based in Da Nang and Quang Nam in central Vietnam. And as an anthropologist going back and forth there from 2002 to 2008, I focused mostly on rural and urban families, intergenerational and gender relations. A lot of them were families that had split up during the war and then reunited. And I was looking at the language development of young children and at intergenerational relations as a way of trying to understand the cultural trope of sacrifice in light of the many social and political and economic changes that were going on in Vietnam. Today, though, I'll just talk about one funeral, and specifically the text objects that were used during this ritual as a way of helping to manage the bereaved's grief and mourning and manage their loss. So just to walk you through, I'll first of all be telling the story of one death that happened later, then justifying why it's important to look at ritual and explaining the distinction that we have in anthropology between affects and emotions, and actually questioning that distinction by looking at the moral sentiment of Thanh Cam in Vietnam. And then the main body of this lecture is really about the one funeral and the text objects that were assembled there as a way of managing grief, and that through these text objects we really see the multiple layers of Vietnam's history and the ways that they intertwine with one another rather than represent these different sets. And show how these texts are used differently outside and inside the home to emphasize different aspects of, for example, citizenship versus kinship. And so the ways that ritual is supposed to manage grief, and at the same time the limits of ritual in doing so. And that's what I'll talk at the very end, is the widow and mother of the deceased struggles in the face of death to overcome their loss. So let me begin, and I'm going to be reading, hopefully to stick to a time. 10 days before that, the Lunar New Year, Bà Nội died in a freak accident in front of her home. A motorcyclist knocked her and her daughter over on their sidewalk in Nha Trang, leaving the daughter unscathed, but killing Bà almost instantly. In Da Nang, where I was conducting research, Yiha had to drop everything and rush to the burial of her mother-in-law. Ha's siblings quickly mobilized to support her. They hired a van and traveled the long distance south to participate in the funeral with her. Yet they were not entirely surprised by this untimely death and were even a bit resentful. They reasoned that ever since the death of her middle-aged son Lam earlier that year, Bà had lost the will to live. The accident now interrupted their busy schedule and really this happiest of time, and cast a dark shadow on this time. Quietly, in the privacy of their homes, these distant affinal relatives in Da Nang grumbled that the death was a form of retribution for Ba's faltering virtue, for she had failed to contain her grief since losing her son. So in this essay, I examine the management of grief through rituals of mourning, including rituals' limits. I analyze how funerary text objects help index the complex meanings and practices associated with Thenkam, or the Vietnamese moral sentiment affect of care and concern for the other out of mutual affection and attachment. And this is rooted in a model of the self as interdependent rather than independent of others. As ethnographers of morality in Vietnam highlight, Thenkam typically refers to sentiments, affects, or emotions that are viscerally felt in the body and that are understood to arise not only naturally between kin and others who are in intimate relationships, but also to drive and motivate the material relations of support between those who share these feelings of Thenkam. So in attending to Thenkam and ritual inscriptions, I trouble the relationship between personal grief and communal mourning. My essay then builds on the work of anthropologists who for over a century have emphasized the social nature of mourning and how funerary rituals as rites of separation, liminality, and reintegration are supposed to work to ease the deceased and bereaved's transitions from ordinary life through extraordinary loss and back again to the realm of the mundane. As Durkheim noted long ago, mourning is not the spontaneous expression of individual emotions, not the natural response of a private sensibility hurt by a cruel loss. It's an obligation imposed by the group through the enactment of ritualized rites. But of course, mortuary rituals can also become sites of contestation and political divisions that rather than reinforce social cohesion, they do the opposite, as Gertz masterfully shows in a funeral gone awry in Java more than 60 years ago, where the rival factions accentuate their differences by refusing to carry out the expected rites. Building on Gertz and the work of Victor Turner on ritual as a process and locus for social drama, more recent anthropologists have analyzed how social divisions and unequal distributions of power within communities are often negotiated and sometimes subverted through mourning rituals, especially the performance of laments. So people like Greg Urban, Lila Abulugo, Janet McIntosh, and many others show that ritual wails and laments help manage loss by serving as conventionalized voicings of grief that instantiate and reinforce gender roles and divisions, while also signaling the community members' desire for social bonds with those most aggrieved. A common assumption in this literature is that culturally meaningful rituals and rites not only teach people how to suffer, but they can also ritually create new memories and forge meaningful relationships that bridge the painful past and present with a more hopeful future. And then it's implied that when mourners have the freedom and the resources to conduct culturally meaningful rites, they may set aside the grief and recover from loss. Yet, as other anthropologists have also shown, grief at times exceeds its ritual management, leaving some mourners in the grip of melancholia that overtakes their body and sometimes life. My essay adds to these bodies of scholarship on mourning and the ritual management of loss by explicitly linking ritual to affect theory, which suggests that affects or felt sensations and states of mind should not be conceptualized as the private domain of individuals. Rather, rituals and affects too, they crucially involve the mediation of now commoditized material objects. As Sarah Ahmed suggests, affects gain their force through circulation and distribution across social and psychic fields, since they're always about human and non-human objects to which we're attached. But instead of acquiescing to a strict division between affects and emotions, as though affects are the so-called pre-subjective, if not pre-social, I actually, like Mazzarella, I regard both as always already both embodied, viscerally felt, and mediated by multiple discursive practices and cultural ideologies. Affects thus are not pure intensities or potentialities whose origin lies deep in the brain. And so instead of just acquiescing to the kind of linguistic anthropological tradition of preferring affect over emotion to distance ourselves from Western-centric understandings of emotion as internal, pre-given, or objectified, Instead, I see them as more interactively and communicatively and thus socially produced. And so I prefer Bolstorff and Lindquist's provocation to set aside this assumption that emotions are the properties of individual persons, as if they're fundamentally prior to social experience or context. And instead, I regard them as thoroughly cultural. And this really invites back our attention to discourse. So my point is not that discourses determine what is felt or emoted, but that they do serve as an important role in articulating the conventional and the normative through different artifacts and acts that set the conditions of possibility and plausibility for those affect sentiments that ought to be shared, performed, and condoned in specific settings. So really, in using affect and sentiment and emotion relatively interchangeably, I'm also invoking an ethnographic context that precludes our understanding of Thinkam as anything but social, mediated, and embodied, full of productive potential and irreducible to a strictly bounded social or psychological domain. Thinkam is really a moral sentiment, and though ideally spontaneously arising and felt as a moral imperative within one's heart or guts, one's lom, it does so only when embedded in webs of intimate relationships of care and concern that are materialized and indexed through verbal and nonverbal channels. Thus, the notion of Thinkam invites us to regard affect sentiments as embodied and at least partially distributed and circulating across persons through the mediation of multiple semiotic modalities. So in the rest of this essay, I examine how orthographic forms of writing, and the materials on which they're printed or embroidered provide templates for the mourners to help frame, manage, and possibly contain their Thinkam through the structured circulation and distribution at a funeral. And like my predecessors, I'm really interested in how inchoate feelings of loss and grief are mobilized in a ritual context to re-narrate and create an ideal version of what mourners wish the world were like, by focus here on the neglected aspect of mourning, namely the construction and destruction of written artifacts. These objects are not mere props. Like all linguistic acts, they help to constitute the worlds of those who produce, view, and display them. But whereas past work has examined the oral, and kinesthetic modes of ritual, such as dancing or singing or lamenting, music, here I'm focusing on the writing, on the written objects. And how these inscriptions that immediately follow death may circulate and distribute affects to help channel mourner sentiments and organize their moral conduct in a ritual process intended to transform the deceased into a benevolent ancestor. So here I'm drawing on a rich body of literature that considers this inscription specifically and literacy more broadly as a special technology and mode of communication that helps institutionalize certain epistemologies or modes of thinking and also feelings. And so I link the affect sanctioned in the ritual management of death to the broader political economy of Vietnam, where since the 1986 introduction of Doi Moi, or renovation reforms, a transition has been taking place to a market-based, yet still officially socialist economy. But I focus less on affect's involvement in effecting and legitimizing this transformation than on how these transformations are made manifest in the types of effective resonances that are encouraged by the specific inscriptions. I then also consider these conventionalized emotions' limits in disciplining and governing the effective conduct of individuals, since I'm averse to providing a totalizing and teleological account of ritual's efficacy. And I'll take this up at the end of this talk by focusing on Banoi and asking, like Angela Garcia, what if the structure of ritual repetition creates not the working through of grief, but its intensification? How might it then become a constitutive force of a kind of mourning that does not end? So what I'll show is how the text objects such as banners and placards recently available for mass consumption in contemporary Vietnamese funerals call forth different sets of temporalities and forms of historical consciousness. I suggest that these help intensify and disperse feelings of loss for the bereaved, while also displaying their consumer status as moral beings who are able to lavishly attend to the deceased. Funerary inscription practices are thus indexing mourners' thinkam with one another by emphasizing that mourning well implies being well. And here morality is not a universalist code. It's rather a context-dependent way of interacting, where the good person is somebody who has a lot of feelings, but doesn't necessarily express them outwardly. And so to better understand the reactions to Banoi's later death, I turn now not to her funeral, but to the originary event that led to her downfall, the elaborate funerary preparations that immediately followed her son Lam's death 6 months earlier. And admittedly, Lam's funeral was somewhat special in that this was conducted by a highly positioned family that had more resources than most of my study participants. But that's how we often create theory in anthropology, by focusing on a somewhat exceptional case to also learn what it tells us more generally. So through the detailed analysis that follows, I reveal some of the tensions involved in enacting moral subjectivity and manufacturing class distinction at a time when the market, state, and home may be understood as fractals, or tropes and terrains that are simultaneously congruent and also set in opposition to one another. It was early on a hot, humid Sunday morning in July 2007 when I followed Harm into Yeha's living room in the center of Da Nang. Having just learned an hour before that Lam had suffered a stroke, the last thing I expected to confront was his corpse, lying flat on a bamboo cot, naked and covered only with a white sheet, an oil candle burning next to his head. Kneeling on the floor nearby was his mother, Banoi, a black-haired widow wearing all white. Only a day ago, she had come from Nyatang to Da Nang to spend the summer with her grandchildren. But now here she was, moaning and crying inconsolably at the unexpected loss of her only son. As we made our way up the stairs, I glimpsed Lam's daughter sobbing quietly in her room. Ha, his new widow, was in another room. She lay sprawled on the bedroom floor, at times silent and still, at times weeping. Her tears drowning out her words, she recounted how she had been with her husband at the hospital, but he could not speak, could not say a thing. No parting words. Since Lam was still in the prime of his life and had died suddenly and unexpectedly from a stroke at the hospital, according to Vietnamese cosmology, his death could have been bad, were it not for the rituals enacted to transform his potentially wandering, angry ghost into a benevolent ancestral spirit who would guard the home. To produce this transformation, family members had no time to dally in grief. They needed to fashion a different narrative of Lam's good death and, by extension, good life and afterlife, of him as a venerated ancestor who had lived a righteous life. This process of ritually transforming Lam's death began almost instantly. First of all, by converting the space of the living into a sacred space for the dead. While women cooked and consoled, men hung a large black and white banner on the threshold above the entrance to Lam's home. Printed in large capital letters in the highly accessible Romanized Khmer script that 90% of the population today is able to read, the banner announced to the general public the event and feelings to take place, a condolences and memorial service for Comrade Le Hio Lam. And this abbreviated DC preceding Lam's name is widely recognizable as standing for Damchi, or comrade. And this was the first in a series of inscriptions outside the house, fixing Lam's socio-political identity as concordant with a Vietnamese one-party state. It signified his and his family's relatively high status in the political economy of the community, where cadres still enjoy a wide range of privileges. Below this banner, on the front wall, men then hung a kaufa, or death notice announcement. Also addressed to the general public, this poster-sized informational placard was likewise printed in the same Romanized script. The announcement's wordy formal register and blank spaces left for dates to be filled in by hand added to the bureaucratic, mass-produced, generic genre of the form. It implicitly located Lam within this bureaucracy of relatively depersonalized, uniform feelings of regret. Now, philosopher Paul Ricoeur argues that whereas spoken discourse has the character of a fleeting event, inscription or written discourse fixes events. So the banner and placard were literal inscriptions in this sense. They functioned as public texts that were seen and read by multiple audiences again and again over time, marking Lam's revered public identity as an upstanding, bona fide citizen of the modern literate state. In addition, this placard worked to link the past and future to the present, serving as a fixed announcement of what was happening, our family extremely regretfully announces, a fixed story of what had happened, Mr. Leahy Lam, born in 1960, died at such and such a time, and a fixed plan for what would happen, as enumerated on the placard's funeral program, the Tung Jing Le Tang. This consisted of a pre-printed schedule and list form that outlined the series of ceremonial events that would culminate in the burial of Lam's body 3 days later. It was repeatedly consulted by the public and family, who ensured that it was followed quite precisely and even punctually. And thus the Kaufor's enumerated rituals were to help Lam transition peacefully to the world beyond and help the bereaved cope with his loss. The death notice schedule also further works as a future-oriented story and not merely a plan, since it encoded a description not just of the thing that has happened in Aristotle's words, but a kind of thing that might happen. The coda at the bottom is especially telling. It stipulated, during the funeral period, in the bereaved family's confusion, if mistakes occur, please kindly forgive. This plea, subjunctivized with the lexeme neo, if, anticipates possible contingency or trouble and so postulates a desired solution. It appeals to others' pathos and so provides, in Bruner's sense, a model of the world as it could be and as it ought to be, but how it might not be. Mistakes may occur, and our idealized moral standards may not be lived up to, but should be excused due to the extraordinary circumstances of grief during the bounded period of funerary mourning. With a simple insertion of if, then, a transgression of norms would be authorized and given a reason. Confusion due to the overflowing of usually unsanctioned but now warranted emotion. The plea for forbearance can also be read as a general attempt to forestall open and emotionally wrought contestation or argument over how to carry out the ritual actions, since it's not that uncommon for painful arguments to erupt among the mourners over what constitutes proper action. When parties each claim that their way is the correct and traditional way to organize the funerary proceedings, they reinforce rupture rather than the desired harmonious coming together in mutual support, or thinkam. So the banner, acting as a public plea posted by a communist-affiliated family, thus helped ratify and forestall normally dispreferred emotional expressions. In contrast to these and other text artifacts outside the house that uniformly use the national Romanized script to inscribe Lam as a modern political and economic socialist man, to be mourned as a loss to the Vietnamese state, inside the house, the text objects and the story they told were more hybrid. So were the more personalized affects they conjured, as attested by mourners' more violent tears inside than outside the house. Surrounding the coffin in the living room, for example, were both standard inscriptions printed with the same uniform message, Vokum Tungteek, endless loving and regrets or grief, addressed to Lam and admired by his survivors, and also yellow calligraphic inscriptions embroidered on red cloth that index a highly poetic formal register used at temples and on ancestral altar plates. These latter embroidered objects use a new orthography that has only just appeared in the last decade in Vietnam. It's designed to mirror the now defunct Trung Nom or Sino-Vietnamese script developed by literati many centuries ago, and these texts were addressed to the ancestors. Presumably, this would be the language and script needed to communicate with these beings who long predate market socialism, communism, and French colonialism. The language recalls Vietnam's thousand-year Chinese occupiers who, along with Confucianism and Mahayana Buddhism, also brought the nation literacy in Juhan, or traditional Chinese script. And although they're readable to the present literate public, this new calligraphic Sino-Romanized Vietnamese script evokes a sense of the longue durée that extends both far into the past and into the endless future of Lam as an ancestor. It's a temporality that could induce both despair and reassurance in its depth and longevity. As though to reinforce this link to ancestry and to Vietnam's Chinese-influenced past, alongside its present modern orientation, the family also commissioned a ritual specialist who expertly and on time, which almost never happens, decked Lam's smiling corpse in a Western suit, and then wrapped him in a yellow silk cloth inscribed in red traditional Chinese script with a tzu, or incantation. This is a prayer genre that's typically performed to drive out spirits and evil, to protect and bless the deceased, to help him leave the earth peacefully and without concern. Together, these multilingual inscriptions, using a multiplicity of registers, invoked a polyphony of voices with overlapping historical resonances to encode and license the feelings of intense, eternal sorrow, and also to materially evoke the sacred by using a marked form of language. They worked to intellectualize Lam's enduring social role as a family man and linked him as a well-cared-for ancestor to a notion of family well-being, affluence, and distinction. Founded on continuity in time and by using scripts which, ironically, most locals are now barely literate in, if at all. Like ancient Hebrew for many diasporic Jews, traditional Chinese for contemporary Vietnamese here function as a sacred text precisely in its illegibility, acquiring its manner and authority of timeless tradition thanks to its opacity, and again, through its being a marked form of language. I don't mean to imply, of course, that the textual objects had autonomous power, nor that they were definitively fixing such binaries as inside-outside, private-public, or family-state. What is important to note, though, is that these texts were not just pro forma either. They were repeatedly consulted and admired by family members and guests who gazed at and nearly inaudibly read them. And of course, not everybody reads the same way, but for those who do, it's invoking certain feelings. And so through their medium, color, script, register, and content, the banners and placards were helping to inscribe mourners' social geography and their sets of affects associated with specific roles and identities that Lam had had. Together with other embodied rituals, they worked to concretize and reinforce an ordered, melancholic sense of the sacred, of sacred veneration for the deceased and also for tradition itself, by that was communally being distributed across mourners in the spirit of Thangam to distribute the grief. By the end of that fateful Sunday afternoon, then, the tears that had been flowing abundantly during the first hours of mourning were largely drying up. Lam's mother, widow, daughter and son, sisters and friends now were all able to come together and greet their condolence-bearing guests with relative composure, even as many of them continued to feel turmoil and anguish at their loss that they expressed later after the guests left by continuing to weep. Grief, in other words, was being culturally channeled and mastered through mourners' ritual engagements, including the assembling and reading of textual objects inside and outside Lam's home. And so by evening time on Wednesday after the burial, Lam's close relatives were even joking and bantering with each other. They were enacting a cultural mandate to keep a bright face, for as the saying goes, "Doi goi, aina ya," whomever the heavens call upon should respond. This was an expression that people explained to me entailed accepting one's fate with equanimity and cheerfulness, or at least its outward expression, to allow the dead to enjoy a good death and in this way, well-being. As Ha's sister explained, norms of Thangam required that Lam be released from earth now that his body was no longer sentient and present in the home. This closure of the first phase of mourning was subtly marked when, seconds before hired ritual man carried the coffin out of the house, Lam's funeral committee man deliberately ripped down the paper placard to signal the end of the official mourning period, in which possible mistakes such as emotional outbursts that were referenced in the Kaufa announcement were excusable. The life cycle of Lam's role as a virtuous citizen was ending, as texts emphasizing his professional and political contributions were disappearing. Instead, and now focusing on Lam's private loving rather than public political relationships, new cloth banners with new sets of written texts that included a melange of scripts that acted as fractals of tradition and modernity now hung at the altar. The cloth, like its focal message emphasizing kinship, was presumably more durative than the paper in its index content emphasizing citizenship. Similar to the embroidered red cloth I described earlier, this new polyphonic altar objects use traditional Chinese script alongside the poetic, calligraphic, Sino-Romanized Vietnamese script that imitated the Chu Nom script of old. Both languages' content and form again use the Confucian fixed idioms to affirm Lam's role as a deeply beloved flesh and blood kin, and underscored Confucian virtues of spousal loyalty and filial piety to avow relatives and friends' great affection for Lam. In using these contrastive orthographies and lexicons, the altar cloth indexed oppositions in roles and relationships that we may characterize as ephemeral or new versus eternal and durative, public institutional versus private familial, modern bureaucratic versus traditional spiritual, and all were ascribed to Lam and assigned to his mourners who, like him, were both affiliated with and indeed representative of state institutions and familial identities that they expected to embody and to enact morally. The speed with which these banners were produced attests both to their importance to family members and also to the new relations of production and consumption in Vietnam that allowed this high-positioned family of means to purchase and commission these material objects without delay. But of course, other families in my study with less means also assembled similar objects. And like this family, rely on money and on gifts to cover the costs of the funeral, and in that way enact these relations of exchange and of Thenkam. So the point is not that just that it was possible for this family to spend lavishly in mourning Lam, and conversely to receive these gifts of lavish text objects, but that they deemed it important to do so, rather than abiding by former communist injunctions to cut down on ritual, seeing ritual as feudalistic and wasteful. And so this funeral might be, it might be tempting for us to understand this funeral as indicative of a decline of socialist sentiment and resurgence of capitalist, neoliberal, and globalizing forces that have shaped Vietnam's marketization over the preceding decades of Doi Mai policies. But I think this would be wrong. I actually think that the scripts assembled outside and inside Lam's home recount an at least partial story of Vietnam's multiple overlapping layers of history that my informants like to tell me has been punctuated by periods of foreign occupation, native resistance, and the development and disappearance of specific forms of writing. Outside Lam's home, all the text objects had these black and white, Romanized inscriptions iconic of the deceased public persona and his affiliates' high rank within this bureaucratized sphere, in which mourning and loss are framed as bounded sentiments with finite beginning and a prescribed moral end. Exclusive use of the Quoc Ngu inscriptions here is consistent with teleological accounts of Vietnam's language history that narrate the disappearance of the Chu Han and the Chu Nom scripts that were historically only accessible to the elite in favor of the more accessible Quoc Ngu alphabetic script. Earlier in the 20th century, the Communist Party had embraced this form of writing to facilitate the young state's modernization aspirations. By instituting a mass literacy campaign aimed at spreading enlightened propaganda to mobilize the people to fight for independence and eradicate the superstitions and feudal bonds shackling both the peasantry and educated urbanites. In framing Quoc Ngu in opposition to French that the French colonists had tried to institute, patriotic nationalists were able to suppress the script's earlier blemished association with missionary Catholicism in Vietnam. But while the Romanized script outside Lam's home may fit a socialist tale of progress and democratization, this would be an at best incomplete story, since Vietnam's southern regime had also adopted the very same script long before the nation's unification in 1975. And the script's creative deployment in both these block letter inscriptions and in the colorful calligraphic Sino-Romanized Vietnamese that sits alongside the, in fact, never defunct Chinese script inside Lam's home further complicates this narrative that sought to minimize Vietnam's Chinese-influenced Confucian past. Instead, these usages highlight both more personal sentiments and relations and Vietnam's syncretic traditions to reveal the inherently incomplete process of transforming society's cultural practices. In light of Vietnam's history of scripts and their shifting political associations over decades and centuries, Lam's funeral flies in the face of Weberian accounts that insist on coupling secularization with modernization. Rather, we see that multiple scripts remain and indeed seem to be invented anew to evoke the sacred and political, hinting at historical continuities between market-oriented and pre-revolutionary funerary practices. Designed to aid the deceased person's soul travel to the other world, these practices, including the use of scripts, help mourners share the sadness, Tieborn, by affirming Thenkam relations among them. These scripts and other mortuary rituals, as people told me, together serve as material affirmations of Thenkam that reinforce relationships among the living and between the living and the dead. The objects used here, like the material ruins described by El Navarro Yashin, that serve to reanimate sentiments and memories evoked by their very materiality. But just as Maloney argues regarding North Vietnamese rituals, we can't see the funeral as an exact reflection of pre-revolutionary practice, as though the Communist Party efforts to simplify ritual and emphasize patriotism was completely ineffective. Rather, we see at this funeral both discourses sitting rather comfortably alongside one another. The patriotic, citizen-oriented elaboration of identity and affects are emphasized outside the home, while kinship and continuity of the generations is emphasized inside. Moreover, while the purchase of pre-printed placards may index a growing market of mass production, it also concretizes continuities between Vietnam's present bureaucratic culture, in which forms and always have to be filled and filed, and the former Confucian and colonial regimes whose practices of written genealogies that were carefully maintained by clan groups also were part of people's habitus long before literacy came to be so widespread in the second part of the 20th century. The inscriptions throughout Lam's funeral, then, suggest that by dint of official historiographic processes of erasure, Vietnam's communist revolution may not have been so much a break with tradition as its reformulation and redirection. Further, we may understand the contemporary liberalization efforts under Doi Moi, where the state has sought to increasingly privatize and marketize Vietnam's economy while still remaining an officially socialist regime, as condoning and facilitating this hybridity and polyphony prevalent at the funeral, leading a model communist family to go against these injunctions to simplify ritual and instead conspicuously display Lam's more than dual role as comrade, entrepreneur, revered father, husband, son, friend, and so on. Forms of social action in the context of market reforms in later post-socialist Vietnam nations thus make visible the multiple partial ways in which we might understand neoliberal transformations in these locales, where neither selves nor states are ever divorced from the multiple historical contexts that constitute them. Thus, in the funeral, we witness not so much a polarized opposition between tradition and modernity, or socialism versus capitalism, or ostentation versus restraint, but a layering of these, literally again, and the dressing of Lam with both a business suit evoking modernity and the traditional Chinese zoo, where the ancient script evoking spirit-related concerns with ancestors encompasses and embraces his body. And likewise, we see this lamination of the seeming contradictions in the invocation of eternal sorrow and love on the altar banners and wreaths, yet the practical expectations embodied in the adages prescribing that upon burial the bereaved accept their misery with a cheerful smile. And we saw that also in the Cao Fa, in the announcement that I talked about earlier. So in each of these cases, we see that Thenkam is displayed through prescribed engagements with commoditized objects that mediate people's relationships with one another. And as I've hinted, while the Indo inscriptions emphasize the personal emotional bonds with the deceased to encode eternal regret, they didn't explicitly demarcate an allowable space for the expression of grief or transgression of norms. like the more public genres that were outside. Long after official mourning had ended, however, some of the bereaved's emotions continued to overflow the genres into which they were being channeled. And so Lum's mother and widow at times erupted into unsanctioned, tearful bouts. Rather than diminish despair, it seemed that the inscriptions affirming eternal grief actually served to reinforce it, bringing into question the notion that mourning is ever complete. Indeed, for Banoi and Ha, the elaborate production, posting, and later immolation of the written texts may have enacted and replaced the meaning of Lum's death from its immediate tragic context and inscribed him in this larger narrative of virtue and national belonging. But it provided little room for the despair they continued to feel despite the efforts to collectivize and redistribute grief. With the deliberate destruction of the text artifacts marking the end of his official public roles, the space and time for expressing attachment and transgressing norms symbolically and literally receded further and further into the interior of the house, where sorrow was affirmed, inscribed on durative cloth, but its expression in public was denied. What Lum's mother and widow needed, it seemed, went beyond the intensified condensation of ritual over a short span of days. They needed to rework the relation of Tenkam, or sentiments and relations with the living son and husband, and replace them with new, apparently incommensurate relations with him as a no longer living personage, to ensure both his and their different forms of well-being. In the face of premature, unexpected death, they struggled. Ritual mourning had not sufficed to dissipate their loss. As the days passed and I continued to visit and sit with the grieving family, it struck me that despite Ha's best efforts to suppress her sadness for her dead husband, still, night after night, in the privacy of her bedroom, she continued to cry in despair. While by day she returned to work, in the evening she, like her mother-in-law, would stare for hours at her husband's colorfully inscribed altar, bitter with sorrow. Week after week, Ha found it difficult to eat, clean her house, drive to work, or drive to the grave. And while her family acknowledged that her sorrow would last for a long time, as the text was a constant reminder of endless loving regret, they also insisted that the time for expressing sorrow had passed with the burial and ripping down of the outside banners that had deintellectualized the grieving space. In their typical elliptical manner of speaking, no one said exactly when the time for crying had passed, but merely they had, Samroy, they kept saying, and repeated that once a body is properly buried, mourners must let it ascend to the heavens in peace, rather than continually call it back. Increasingly and no less in the spirit of Tenkam than their earlier solicitation for her, her relatives now grew worried and impatient, admonishing her for the tears that were making her tired, an ineffectual mother and to her daughter and son. They suggested that the Tenkam, or bonding in love that she had shared with her husband in marriage, now got in the way of her functioning as a good, strong parent. As though in sympathy, they invoked the saying, to go on grieving is just self-tormenting because the dead cannot rise again. Thus, they signaled a local understanding of ethics as contingent, since there are at least two ways of showing Tenkam that depend on the timing and the participants involved, and that are incommensurate with one another. The fate of Banoi, who passed away months later, turned even worse. I gathered then, in light of what later happened, that for a person to become an ancestor, the living had to suspend their everyday forms of relating to and showing care and concern, or Tenkam, to the newly dead, or another life could become endangered. So, despite their initial empathy for Lum's bereaved mother at the time of the loss, her Afghans now implicitly blamed Ba for having given up on life after her son's death. Her excessive wailing at the time of the funeral and her cries at the time that there was nothing more to live for were now re-narrated as haunting reasons for her untimely demise. In essence, Ba's unfortunate death was now being used as a warning against those who break down and who upset others who are working equally hard to maintain this culturally desired equanimity following loss. A mother's love or viscerally felt encam with her son can thus become problematic, and what constitutes virtue in one place and time can actually be coded as a vice in another. Now, it's possible to think that this concern with Baz and has prolonged mourning is related to new market dynamics that require citizens to work and produce like good neoliberal subjects rather than wallow in grief and despondency. But again, I think that would be wrong. Instead, I see the text objects as indexing and the intertwining and lamination of one market logic with another, where neoliberal, socialist, colonial, and Confucian moral codes effectively value similar effective modes. After all, the moral mandate to display stoicism, combined with filial, spousal, and parental piety, was no less compelling in the war and the pre- and the post-war years when continual material deprivation required people to go on uncomplaining rather than give in to the loss. And similarly with this pressure on women to carry on, it is consistent with formally altered but substantively enduring gender norms in Vietnam, where women continue to be idealized as sacrificial mothers and caregivers. So among the people I knew, virtue, Dao Duc, but usually what they equated with Thanh Cam, was conceptualized as contingent, emergent, and context-dependent, what scholars interpret as Aristotelian rather than universalist versions of ethics. Morality is not a static code, but rather requires dynamic judgments on the part of practitioners who must adapt potentially competing and incommensurate norms to the demands of the situation. In other words, the virtues and the simultaneous duties of devotion and love to one's children and spouse, and the conduct and affects to be expressed to index these sentiments that are all glossed as viscerally felt and materially expressed in Cam, are not made up of fixed rules or written codes, though these may be helpful in mobilizing them. Rather, embodying moral personhood involves dynamic interaction and the judgments of others as well as oneself. Affects exceed their codified or ritualized contexts, not because they're prior to discourse or outside of discourse, but because they're entwined within moral, and in the case of mourning, inscribed precepts that traverse several political and economic regimes. So to conclude, my analysis has shown how commoditized literacy objects can help frame or set the conditions of possibility for some mourners' feelings to organize and modify their experience of bereavement by broadcasting certain affects and excluding others. I've argued that neither emotions nor affects are simply internalized, objectified properties of individual persons, but rather they arise in the flux of interaction with others. And so I've suggested how funerary text objects, among other ritual acts, help mobilize the circulation and distribution of these feelings among mourners to alleviate and partially contain grief for the bereaved. By spelling out the norms of conduct, these objects help reinforce certain cultural beliefs regarding appropriate mourning, so that the good person in Vietnam is somebody who acts as a good mourner, someone who can ensure the well-being of the dead and thereby also strive to guarantee the well-being of those who must cope with the loss. But of course, there's a limit to this type of structural interpretation and to the structuring power of ritual itself. As I described, the text object's ability to channel Thanh Cam efficaciously and definitively over a longer temporal frame than the funeral itself remained more problematic. In contrast with a paper placard that's easily destroyed, marking the end of its message, the feelings and actions that it had sanctioned remain in circulation and does not so easily disappear, as neither did the deeds and misdeeds of Lam's mother. A volatile excess of mourning remained, where Thanh Cam with the living did not translate smoothly into Thanh Cam with the dead. The tensions we observe between personal grief and communalized mourning, finally, are not simply the products of Vietnam's new economy and its freedom to engage in high ritual. Like the Chinese scripts that never really disappeared, there are enduring and disturbing themes that reappear in new variations, here metonymized by the calligraphic Sino-Romanized Vietnamese inscriptions that I've documented now stand astride the ancient and bureaucratic texts of old and new. They speak to new concerns in marketizing Vietnam to represent tradition as a consumable and potentially profit-yielding project, then binding people together through these acts of exchange may paradoxically guard against the corrupting influence of capitalist relations and the disruptions that they may affect in the traditional ordering of society. It's of course beyond my capacity to predict what moral personhood will continue or newly look like in Vietnam. But aside from outlining the affordances and limits of ritual bolstered through these written commoditized objects, I hope to have helped you glimpse how morality is enacted in terms of shifting and potentially competing concerns with the well-being of multiply related persons that are here crystallized and circulated through exchanges of Thenkam. Thank you. Yeah.
So then are none of the placards are pulled down, banners are burned, none of the textual objects that you spoke about are then saved?
No, the paper placards are not saved. They were taken to the burial site and burned along with other, it's very common at Vietnamese funerals to have paper clothes and all these other objects, so all of them are going with him. They're part of the thing that's going with him to help him in the other world. They were not kept. They're not recycled.
But then there's the part that stays in the home.
Right, and the altar inscriptions. So the one that was before the burial, that was put away. But then, you come home and you see, oh, that looks really similar. But it's different. It's not the same one. And that one hangs for at least 3 years. The living room was transformed into an altar for the dead. And so it's a constant reminder for him. And only after 3 years, after a special ritual, then it goes upstairs with a normal ritual table.
So death anniversaries?
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing. So then they mark the death for the next 50 days. Every week there was a ritual, every 7 days. And then on the 49th day, there was a big ritual feast. And then again on the 100 days, and then every year. They follow the lunar calendar, actually, but then every year there's a death anniversary where this is continued.
And no new banners are produced on those anniversary days?
No, it's these ones. Yeah.
This strikes me very much as, to use the term very loosely, as a Confucian funeral.
Yeah.
The Chinese ones there, the husband and wife.
Right.
What was the other? Oh, the filiality.
Right,
aspect,
exactly.
Very specifically part of
Yeah.
the Confucian.
Yeah.
Now, but there were no Buddhist aspects. Except perhaps for the yellow thing he was wrapped in.
Yeah.
Shrine.
Yeah, well, this family was not Buddhist, but if I'd, I don't have time to talk about everything. So, for example, the food was actually vegetarian, for example, in honor of Buddhism. And then when his mother died, they actually invited another ritual specialist to kind of clean up the space right before the new year. So they do have some Buddhist aspects, but this family was specifically not religious. And yet, it was more the women than the men who did frequent Buddhist temples. And so there's the kind of a combination, which really speaks to the syncretism in Vietnam. So they also had a portrait of Ho Chi Minh, above their altar. But that doesn't preclude them from using Confucian and Buddhist symbolism.
I think Keith Taylor uses the word accumulation.
Yeah.
It's all sort of there.
Yeah.
And brought together in different
Yeah.
ways.
Right. And there's a real, when you talk to people are always telling me about how Vietnam is syncretic. They don't use the word syncretic, but they say, we borrow from everywhere. And so we have the best of everything. Yeah. There's less this position of it's going to be only Catholic, or it's going to be only Buddhist, or it's going to be only spirit something, It's they kind of invite these multiple traditions and mix them.
But I was struck by the ones carrying the coffin and the,
Yeah.
like a better term, uniform that they were wearing.
Yeah.
Did they describe the reason for that at all?
I think that I didn't see this at all funerals, and I think that this really speaks to this family's. They were rich, you know, compared to other people. They had a lot of means, and so they really lavishly mourned him. This is part of their distinction, to hire two live bands, you know, one wearing the kind of, it almost looks like military uniforms, and the other playing the traditional instruments, and then having this ritual specialist, you know. And all of these relations involve money and involve gifts and involve exchange, and this really calls into question the old distinction between, you know, as if money corrupts everything. Money is right out there, and distinction is done through these material objects.
What was the deceased position?
He was an entrepreneur. He was a party member, but he was in private industry, and so yeah,
Both public and private studies.
that's right. Yeah,
Presumably
Yeah.
both
yeah,
elements.
yeah, and it's. Yeah, and it wasn't just him. I mean, I think that a lot of this, also the fact that his wife's sister, he was the implant into the community. Both his wife's family and him had traveled to the north during the 1950s and then came back to their native land. So he was originally from Nyatang, and she was originally from Da Nang. She was born in the north, actually. His sister, his wife's sister worked in the government. His wife's brother was actually living in Hanoi and was in the government. So they have a lot of official connections, which is why they have so much of this, they have a lot of Thinkam within the community. And they have a lot of resources to display that. And that's what makes this funeral somewhat special. But the texts themselves are very common, and I've seen them also even at American Vietnamese funerals. Not so much the citizenship, you know, but the this mix of inside the house of both the bureaucratic kind of black and white and the red and yellow calligraphic things. You also see that here.
Which is sort of imperial.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember being in Hanoi around Tet time.
Yeah.
You would have the vertical banners. but
Right.
It would be written in the Quoc Ngu.
Exactly.
And no sign really of the characters there.
Yeah.
So this
Yeah.
position
Yeah, but that's what you see here. You see Chinese on one side and the Quoc Ngu on the other side, except that the Quoc Ngu looks like the Chu Nom.
But as
Yeah.
you say, the Quoc Ngu was made into
Yeah.
a sort of
Exactly.
type of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was just seeing a red banner in
Uh-huh.
with the Quoc Ngu just written in.
Right, right. Yeah,
Nothing as
right,
traditional
right.
as this.
Yeah. And that may speak to the kind of regional differences between a place like Da Nang versus Hanoi, where the simplification was much more complete.
This was 40 years ago.
Okay, so there you go. That's that too. It was probably a lot less kosher back then. Yeah. Yeah.
I was about to talk about the banners as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, I think it's interesting to have the Chinese and the Vietnamese group
Yeah.
that way. And probably so in Vietnam they often talk about, so life is a circle.
Right.
And so they talk about 4 stages, that
Right.
you were born, you grow up, then you get sick, and then you die.
Right.
You start another circle.
Yeah.
So I never thought about that, but when I was looking at this banner,
Yeah.
especially, so it's a circle.
Right.
I don't know if
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, there's the motif of the circle constantly in all of this. And that's why it's funny to me to look at scripts, and they really lend themselves to a structuralist argument. And we can stop right there. But if we also care about the kind of psychosocial dimension, then maybe it's not enough to adopt a structuralist argument about what it all symbolizes. And we also need to look at the interaction to see how these texts are read or not read, right? So I'm doing kind of a funny thing of hopefully giving you a beautiful picture of structural ordering of text, and then at the end demolishing that argument. But my point isn't that they're completely unsuccessful. For the most part, they were successful in kind of calming people down and giving them something to do, and prescribing how to feel, or at least how to express those feelings. And when these two did not fit these prescribed norms, they were sanctioned. It wasn't fully accepted that they were not getting over the grief. There was worry. Yeah.
Okay, an observation and a question.
Yeah.
The observation is, this, what you say about the emotional side of this is
Yeah.
completely plausible, but
Uh-huh.
it seems to actually push against your initial
Right. It is.
thesis.
Yeah.
Which is, if I remember correctly,
Uh-huh.
emotions are cultural beings, right?
Yes.
It sounds to me like what you described here supports a very different thesis, which is that emotions are not culturally constructed, but that the morality of grieving and mourning consists of controlling and transforming emotions from what they would otherwise be.
Yeah.
So it's about, her problem is that she didn't follow the script. It's not that her emotions were or were not constructed, that there are emotions there, the morality of which consists of suppressing or channeling. You actually use the word channeling.
Yeah.
That's the point of the talk.
Yeah.
We suggest, actually a much more dynamic
Yeah.
relationship between whatever is going on.
Right.
and whatever is going on.
Yeah.
That's the observation.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Okay, yeah.
That sounds to me more like what you were actually saying. The question actually concerns the role of these text artifacts, which is incredibly interesting. And I guess one way to put the question is like this: who's the writer? Who's the reader?
Mm-hmm.
And one way to think about that might be as you were doing, you're thinking about the spatial relationship. Because there's a front and
Right.
a back.
Right.
There's an outside and inside.
Right.
Creation of a stage.
Yeah.
Reader, sort of an implied reader
Right.
out there.
Right.
Facing this
Right.
screen. And I think that'd be interesting to sort of push that further, to think more about who the implied writer is and who the implied reader is.
Yeah.
And maybe one way to get at that would be to sort of follow some of the, to look at some of the other ways in which writing is used in similar ways. John mentioned manners of text.
Mm-hmm.
In what ways where else would you expect walking down the street to see things proclaimed in this kind of
Right.
sort of assertorial mode? Not like
Yeah.
sale today.
Right.
But this, I mean, these are like assertions.
Yeah. Right. Right.
They're
Yeah.
propositions that are asserted to
Right.
some hypothetical reader. That's weird. I mean, I think we shouldn't take it for granted.
I guess we should, you're right, we shouldn't take it for granted. My observation is that they're actually all over the place. That you often, both in the city and outside, you have these banners hanging, at the entrance to alleyways, like proclaiming patriotism or proclaiming that or proclaiming, whatever they're proclaiming. So these are not uncommon. And what I'm saying is that these texts, both the Chinese and the calligraphic Sino-Romanized Vietnamese, they're most common at pagodas, at altars, at other ancestral rituals. That's where you see them. And I think that with respect to, so people are reading to some extent or maybe ignoring, like that's hard to know what's in people's mind. But they're very much, yeah. Yeah, they could see them, right. And there's other there's text objects and then there's other things, such as Buddhist flags sometimes that people would also put up. But I would say that with respect to the emotions being completely divorced from culture, I'm still not sure about that partly because I think that on the text itself, they're still kind of prescribing a type of feeling, right?
To be moral,
Yeah.
it sounds like,
Yeah.
morality consists
Yeah.
of doing that which is prescribed.
Right.
But the sense of prescription seems
Yeah.
to be motivated by the fact that if it weren't prescribed, it might be otherwise.
Yeah.
Precisely the need to control yourself that gives it that ethical quality.
Right.
If it was simply going to happen, if you were simply going to have the right feelings,
Right.
then it wouldn't be a particularly moral
Yeah.
achievement.
Yeah. I mean, it's a kind of funny thing, right? Because nobody ever prescribes breathe. We all breathe,
And breathing
right?
is not a moral achievement.
And it's not a moral achievement. But to have this enduring loyalty and piety and love is a moral achievement, you know. And so I guess what does it mean to feel, except to feel in relation to something? I'm just not, I don't know, I'm not comfortable with saying that feelings are just kind of completely divorced from the discourses that are framing them.
Right, well, I don't think,
Yeah.
probably none of us would say that.
Yeah.
But I think just if we're thinking about why it would be a moral thing why you have to be exhorted to control your feelings.
Yeah.
To achieve, and why the result is supposed to be a moral achievement.
Yeah.
Suggests that it's, they're dealing with some kind of conflict, potential conflict, or some kind of failure
Right.
that has to be overcome.
Right. Yeah.
One thing that strikes me here is that the public banners are horizontal.
Right.
Private banners
Yeah.
are vertical. And so that when the kind of banners you're talking about over the state banners, be
Right.
patriotic, be this, be that, they're all horizontal, which
Right.
of course is the
Right.
the way of writing.
Yeah.
Where that they've adopted, whereas the vertical is
Yeah.
the sinic way of writing.
Right.
So in a sense, almost by looking at whether it's horizontal or vertical, that there would be a different affectation or relationship to the particular banner.
Right. Yeah. I mean, most banners are horizontal, but then even here you see it's vertical, but we saw also in the previous altar it was kind of 3 panels that were, you had 2 sides that were vertical and one that was horizontal, and the circle that Huyan mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the horizontal banner is more of a modern
Right.
idea of modern propaganda that we see. On top of the board in the classroom, you see a banner, or you see on the road, on the street, there would be a banner.
Yeah.
But here, I think this is something very particularly decorated in the for the altar, and then I would say it's kind of it's quite colorful and in very detail, and I think it's the way to just to decorate and for the deck. I would say in that way.
Yeah.
And I actually have another question. So it's more about comparison. So you mentioned that so after his death, and she
Yeah.
was dead as well.
Yeah.
And was there any other death after that, or 3 deaths in the family? Because
Yeah.
that was kind of maybe superstitious.
Right.
That so if the death was not treated well in
Right.
the family, you would drag more people in the
Yeah.
family to follow him.
Right.
And so, in a way, each family, when they organize the funeral, they carefully prepare or consulted some specialist.
Right.
For example, the time, where to have the grave for the death, and so I think it's, I don't know if it should be the morality to when we talk about how Vietnamese people think death, the death is actually important to spend some time with, and there's also the argument that you need to make sure that you spend don't just grieve or try to contribute a lot of money
Mhm.
later when someone is dead.
Right.
But I think there's a belief that there's another life, and there's the spirit of the dead that could come back and give support and blessing to relatives who are still alive. And so I don't know if that would explain why people spend. So on one hand, it's about the grief about how people show their tingkat
Yeah.
to the dead, but also on the other hand, it's part of the common practice, the
Right.
custom.
Yeah.
And so another thing is, I was thinking about, I don't know if you have made any comparison about the funeral in the Western country, I would say would be very private, I would say. But so if you really spend some time in Vietnam, and if you know your neighbor is going to have a funeral, and then it's going to be 3 days, you would hear music,
Right.
and you would hear chanting, and so people mourning, lamenting for a couple of days. So that would be my
Yeah.
observation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a thing that I'm not discussing all of these other modalities that are reinforcing this message that's here, right? There is a lot of music, a lot of pomp and circumstance that Bam Singh also, I think because our attention maybe is so drawn to these other modalities, we sometimes can ignore how these texts already encapsulate some of these structures and ways of managing death. And like you said, this proud of showing Thenkam it's not a unidirectional, force of just, I'm going to give to the dead. There is an expectation from the dead, just like as there is an expectation among the living. It involves reciprocity. It involves exchange. What I've argued in the past is that there is, it's more useful to think of it as asymmetrical reciprocity, where it's not a tit for tat. There's kind of delayed gratification and kind of long enduring debts rather than immediate dispensation of my debts, your debts, we're all clear. It's more about maintaining the relationship through, in Vietnamese there's Kien Tan Yung Lui, to respect those above and yield to those below, that is part of the asymmetrical reciprocity.
I'd like to thank
Yeah.
you for coming, bringing
Thank you.
to our attention such an interesting and obviously engaging topic. Thanks to everyone for coming to our first lecture of the year. If you'd like to speak with her more afterwards, we'll be going out to lunch, but also you can speak with her right up at the podium. Thanks everyone, have a good day and a good weekend.
Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share this with you.